Good day, everyone. I am Kevin Aguila, and together with Miss Ria Monica Populi, we were going to discuss all about the feminism. Today, we are going to introduce how to do feminist criticism of literature. But before we do that, we need to give a quick background on feminism and the history of feminism. Because that's going to lay the ground of work for the types of ideas, concepts, dynamics, and theories that we are going to look for when we approach our feminist criticism. It is important to understand that there is a clear distinction between feminism and feminist criticism. You most likely heard the term feminism before, but you might not know how it can be applied to analyzing literature in the form of feminist criticism. So that's what our topic all about. So feminism has three important definitions. So the first one is the dictionary definition of feminism, which is the theory of political, economic, and social equality of sexes. There's a word that not appearing in this sentence, so that might come as a surprise to you. When people think of feminism, they think of women's rights and equality for women. But unfortunately for feminism, some of the ideas that lay the foundation of feminism have gotten lost in the political and social debate over the years. And it is important to understand that feminism does not just refer to the experience of women. It is also refers the experiences of men within this larger system of patriarchy. So feminism isn't just about advancing the rights and equality of women, while that is very important. It is about bringing both of the sexes to an equal level in terms of political power, economic power, and social equality, social freedom, social liberation. And when we talk more about gender theory, we will realize that feminism is not just about women and women's rights. However, in the history of feminism, it has often been associated with organized activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. So, this is the mental image that we often have of when it means to be feminist. And we think of often women who are organizing, protesting, running for political office on behalf of women's rights and women's interests. And this is a wide range of rights and interests, everything from equal pay, equal access to opportunity, equal access to education, even back in the year of 1970s, even equal opportunity to play sports. And also, in addition, this can refer to larger political topics like the right of the safe and legal access to abortion, which is a huge topic. It comes up frequently in literature because this is an idea that has shaped the experience of women's lives for as long as we've had civilization. And in addition, feminism now has expanded this definition to include a sort of fight against gender based expectations and the larger gender stereotype that are built out of these expectations. So, as women have gained more power and opportunity to access education, jobs, and social freedoms, now we've taken a look at how we've divided society based on gender and how gender based expectations and stereotypes harm both men and women. This important definition help us understand that or what we're looking for when it comes to feminist criticism. So, feminist criticism involves looking at literature through the lens of a feminist perspective, looking at the relationship between men and women, power dynamics, money dynamics, social and cultural freedom, and gender based expectations. So, when we perform a feminist literary criticism, we're looking at literature and seeing how it informed by feminist theory or more broadly by the politics of feminism. We're looking at the interaction between genders and related to oppression of women in the system of the patriarchy. Feminist literary criticism uses feminist principles and ideology to critique the language of literature. And similar to when we are performing formalist criticism, when we use the word critic, we don't mean to talk about the negatives necessarily, but instead to look closer to perform a close reading. And another way to put this is the read between the lines of literature to see how we can draw out some analysis, some breaking down of our understanding. This means that looking at the author's message, what sort of messages and ideologies can we find in the text that are related to or informed by the dynamics between the uh, genders, the political, economic, and social inequality or equality of sexes. In addition, feminist criticism seeks to analyze and describe the ways in which literature portrays the narrative of male domination by exploring the economic, social, political, and psychological forces embedded within literature. So these four ideas, economic, social, political, and psychological forces are what you should be looking for when you are reading the literature. So look at the dynamics between men and women or women in their own lives, women with other women. The economic, social, and political psychological forces is key, especially when we're looking at some of the earlier literature that represents a period of time in American culture when women were more constrained, when there was more sort of oppression and domination by the male half of society, which is an undeniable fact. We can do feminist criticism without looking at our or in our system. Our social societal system and culture is has been informed by male domination. So men have often held power. They earn money and they have social and cultural freedom. This affects the literature as it was written, whether it's by a man or by a woman. So what we're going to be doing is looking examples of the system of male domination over men through these economic, social, political, and psychological forces. So yes, feminist criticism does involve a deep understanding of these ideas before we find them in literature, just like what we had learned what is simile before we could recognize it in one of our formalist texts. In order to do that, we need to have an understanding of the history of feminism. So in this section, I am going to give a quick background on the history of feminism in order to understand how feminist criticism became one of the main schools of literary criticism, one of the main lenses through which literary critics like yourselves have been looking at literature. According to Maggie Hume and Rebecca Walker, the history of feminism can be divided into three waves. The first feminist waves was in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The second was in the 1960s and 1970s, and the third extends from the 1990s up to the present. Feminist theory emerged from these feminist movements. It is manifest in a variety of disciplines such as feminist geography, feminist history, and feminist theory criticism. Simone de Beauvoir wrote that the first time we see a woman or a woman take up her pen in defense of her sex was Christine de Pizan, who wrote Epetra de Amor, or the Epistle to the God of Love in the 15th century. So Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa and Modesta de Pozzo Divorcee worked in the 16th century, while Marie-Georges de Gournay and Bradstreet and Francis Pauline de la Barre wrote during the 17th. So feminists and scholars have divided the movement's history into three waves. The first wave refers mainly to women's suffrage movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries, mainly concerns with women's right to vote. The second wave refers to the ideas and actions associated with the women's liberation movement beginning in the 1960s, which campaigned for legal and social rights of women, while the third wave refers to continuation of and a reaction to the perceived failure of second wave feminism beginning in the 1990s. So we were going to talk about the first wave. The first wave feminism refers to an extended period of feminist activity during the 19th century and early 20th century in the UK or the United Kingdom and the United States. Originally, it focused on the promotion of equal contract and property rights for women, and the opposition to chattel marriage and ownership of married women and their children by their husbands. However, by the end of the 19th century, activism focused primarily on gaining political power, particularly the right of women's suffrage. Yet, feminists such as uh, Voltaire de Clare and Margaret Sanger were still active in campaigning for the women's sexual, reproductive, and economic rights at this time. So in 1854, Florence Nightingale established female nurses as adjuncts to the military. The first term wave was coined retrospectively after the term second wave feminism began to be used to describe a never feminist movement that focused as much on fighting social and cultural inequalities as political inequalities. Second wave feminism refers to the period of activity in the early 1960s and lasting through the late of 1980s. The scholar Imelda Willihan suggests that the second wave was a continuation of the earlier phase of feminism involving the suffragettes in the UK and the USA. Second wave feminism has continued to exist since that time and coexist with what is termed third wave feminism. So the scholar Estelle Friedman compares first and second wave feminism, saying that the first wave focused on the rights as suffrage, whereas the second wave was largely concerned with with other issues of equality, such as ending discrimination. The feminist activist and author Carol Hanich coined the slogan, "The personal is political," which became synonymous with the second wave. So the second wave feminists saw women's cultural and political inequalities as extricably linked and encouraged when women to understand aspects of their personal lives as deeply politicized rather, and as reflecting sexist power structures. So let us now talk about the third wave. The third wave feminism began in the early 1990s, arising as a response to perceived failures of the second wave and also as a response to the backlash against the initiatives and movements created by the second wave. The third wave feminism seeks to challenge or avoid what it seems the second wave's essentialist definition or femininity, which, according to them, overemphasize on experiences of upper middle class white women. So, a post-structuralist interpretation of gender and sexuality is central to much of the third wave's ideology. So the third wave feminists often focus on micropolitics and the challenge the second wave's paradigm as to what is or is not good for female. The third wave has its origins in the mid 1980s. Feminist leaders rooted in the second wave, like Gloria Anzaldúa, Bell Hooks, Sheila Sandoval, Sherry Moraga, Andre Lord, Maxine Hong Kingston, and many other black feminists sought to negotiate a space within feminists through for consideration of race-related subjectives. So the third wave feminism also contains internal debates between differences or the difference feminists such as the psychologist Carol Gilligan, who believes that there are important differences between the sexes, and those who believe that there are no inherent differences between the sexes and content, but gender roles are due to social conditioning. So to further understand our topic, here's Miss Ria Monica Populi to discuss more about the feminism.
Alright, thank you Mr. Aguila. And now, to understand what gender theory contribute to feminist criticism, we need to understand that gender is a construct. So what do I mean by construct? So it means that gender is built, constructed, or basically gender is something that we have made up as a society. Famous writers and philosophers such as Judith Butler have a revolutionary understanding of gender. And Judith Butler was an American philosopher and gender theorist for many years. And Judith Butler is known for her work as gender trouble feminism and the subversion of identity, which introduced the idea of gender performativity. So this is going to be an important term for us as we look at feminist criticism. So we need to understand. But what do I mean by gender performativity, or what does Judith Butler mean? And now let's talk about gender performativity. So when we say gender performativity, it refers to the idea that within our society, males and females, men and women, especially in American society, are expected to comply with certain gender roles. So, gender roles or gender-based expectations that men and women are supposed to comply with. And they are supposed to perform these roles in society. And Judith Butler writes that gender is something that is created by doing repetitive acts of gender performance. So, these expectations that we have for men and women, you can think about some of the roles that we expect men and women to play. They are created or constructed solely by doing a repetitive act of compliance with that specific gender. An example of gender performativity is that men don't wear dresses, women wear dresses and skirts, and it's important to recognize that gender performativity is based on individual cultures. So, there are other cultures where those gender-based expectations don't exist, okay? However, there are many that are quiet cross cultures, such as ideas about men being breadwinner, men working and making the money for the family, and the gender-based expectation is that women take care of the children, take care of the home, and often take care of the chores of the home or the domestic responsibilities. And even in the case when many women now work, sometimes working more than the men in their relationship. So gender performativity has to do with us individuals and the gender roles that we are sort of expected to comply within a society, as well as the gender roles that we are expected to comply with in terms of relationships. So now that we have a background in feminism and feminist history, as well as a very brief introduction to gender theory, now we are moving to talk about feminist literary theory and what is meant by feminist literary theory or this new lens of feminist literary criticism. So feminist criticism was born out of a response to the patriarchy. So unless you were raised in that one matriarchal society that exists in a rural area of China, for the most part, all people on planet Earth exist in the framework of patriarchy, which is a system or sub-society or a government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. So men in patriarchy hold primary power and predominate roles of political leadership and moral authority. So this is going to be very important as we look at literary feminist works of literature. So as we begin looking at the literature, we're going to start with some older works of literature that go back to the time when women were afforded less freedom and when women were not allowed to vote, when women were certainly not allowed to run for political office, so they had no say in many of the choices in terms of their lives, including when and how many children they had. Childbearing is a big topic in the early works of feminist literature. Next is patriarchal ideology. So patriarchal ideology refers to the idea that in every domain where the patriarchy reigns and where men hold the power, as I mentioned previously, the woman's idea becomes other or she is marginalized and oppressed. So defined only by her difference from the male norms and values. Feminist literary criticism suggests that women in literature were historically presented as objects seen from a male perspective. And also, feminist literary criticism is concerned with how literature and other cultural productions you can perform feminist criticisms of films and TV shows to reinforce or undermine the economic, political, social, and psychological oppression of women. So these are sort of four horsemen of feminist criticism looking at the economic dynamics between men and women in the patriarchy, social oppression of women, their freedoms and their power, and the psychological oppression of women. Feminist literary criticism involves asking questions. So what do I mean by asking questions? So well, Lisa Tuttle was an American-born science fiction, fantasy, and horror author in 1986. She wrote the book Feminism, the Encyclopedia of Feminism, and she gives a succinct description of the goals of feminist criticism to develop and uncover a female tradition of writing. So many students of literature up until the third wave of feminist criticism didn't focus much attention on women writers. And there are fewer well-known women writers from a period up until sort of the third wave of the feminist movement. The goal of feminist criticism is to interpret the symbolism of women's writing so that it won't be lost or ignored by the male point of view. So this attempt to recover from women being placed as other or being marginalized as sort of differing from male norms and values. So questioning that the whole concept of woman as differing from the norm and feminine qualities and women's experiences as somehow being other or differentiated from traditional values, and of course to rediscover the old text. So in addition, feminist criticism seeks to analyze women writers and male perspective, and also giving value which in the system of the patriarchy is historically ignored, marginalized, quieted, or even outright dismissed, and of course to resist sexism in literature. And lastly, feminist criticism is used to increase awareness of sexual politics of language and style, how the dynamics of male and female relationships and the traditional gender-based roles of men and women contribute to the creation of literature, and more importantly, contribute to our understanding of literature. And before I end my discussion, I have here a quote by Bell Hooks saying the significance of the feminist movement is that it offers a new ideological meeting ground for the sexes, a space for criticism, struggle, and transformation. So I include this quote because it is important to remember, as I mentioned earlier, that the feminist movement is not about women. It's certainly important to recognize that feminism is about making sure that women's rights are interested and promoted in a political sphere. However, it's more about ideological meeting ground for the sexes, and as bell hooks referred to it. So it can become a space for, like what I said earlier, for criticism, for struggle, and transformation of the relationship between the sexes.
That concludes our discussion about feminism. We hope that you enjoyed and learned something from us.
But before we formally end our lesson, we will send the 10-item quiz on our Google Classroom right after this video, and we will give you 30 minutes to answer the quiz.
And that is so. I am Kevin Aguila.
And I am Ria Monica Populi, and thank you for listening.